Hello and welcome back to the New South Wales Community of Policy Professionals webinar series. My name is Louisa Mamooni, and as host of the meeting, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today across New South Wales and wherever you may be joining us from, and recognise this land as Aboriginal land. I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining us today. Our guests today are Amy Brown, Deputy Secretary in DPC, and Mick Willing from the New South Wales Police Force, and they will be speaking with us about the social and economic impacts of COVID, and particularly the forecasting work that they've been doing. By way of introduction, Amy Brown loves working for the New South Wales Government. I hope you have that in common with her too, and is passionate about delivering real outcomes that improve the quality of life for our citizens and provide access to opportunities for individuals, as well as delivering value for the taxpayers of New South Wales. She is currently the Deputy Secretary and Head of Strategy and Delivery at DPC, and has formerly worked in infrastructure with PwC and as a lawyer prior to joining DPC. Mick Willing joined the police force in 1990 and became a detective in 1997. He has worked in Sydney and in regional locations on the far south coast and the Illawarra, and became area commander there. From 2011 to 2017, he was commander of the homicide squad and then responsible for counter-terrorism from 2017 to 2019. He was appointed commander of the Central Metropolitan region and also appointed by the Premier of New South Wales as the recovery coordinator responding to the Black Summer bushfires not that long ago. So he's now Assistant Commissioner with the New South Wales Police, and along the way has collected many awards and degrees covering policing, bravery, community service, public administration and leadership. So today Amy and Mick will be talking through some recent collaborative work across the New South Wales Government, which has touched on so many different areas. So it covers crime, child safety, domestic violence, employment, homelessness, and mental health. So it's a very significant piece of work that they'll be talking through with us today. And after the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. I'll put more detail in the chat on how to do that shortly. But Mick and Amy, over to you now.
Thank you, Louise. I hope you can all hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, and I'll jump in before Amy to I guess blame her for this coming about, because this all came from a conversation that Amy and I had post my work in bushfire recovery, and when the head of Premier and Cabinet, Tim Reardon, was chairing a group called Project Spring, looking at economic recovery. So Amy and I had a conversation where, to this day, I think she's at fault for this, and I think she blames me for this. So you want to add anything to that, Amy?
No, let's just get straight into it. But yes, partners in crime, pardon the pun.
So look, this body of work, I guess, is unique in lots of ways. And look, while we all know that COVID itself was primarily a health issue, and it still is plaguing us today, the restrictions themselves that were put in place, health orders, etc., had very real possibility of creating some significant impacts on the economy, and not just New South Wales, of course, but across Australia. So since May last year, and that was the time that Amy and I had some conversations around what might come, I guess, in terms of social outcomes as a result of not just COVID, but the economic downturn that may have eventuated as a result of those restrictions in place. And we were looking at things like crime and other social outcomes, and decided to put together quite a collaboration between DPC and police, and then other agencies that I'll get to try and do a body of work to predict as best we possibly could what might come. So what we tried to do was to create a project which was aimed at developing sort of a consolidated base to develop a whole of government approach to these social outcomes that might arise. So The project itself has 6 elements to it. The first being a lit review, which was conducted by Boxar and Faxia. Some quasi forecasting, the tracking of some identified indicators to see whether or not these outcomes were eventuating. Some analysis, across regions and cohorts, and then finally, and I guess most importantly, the identification of some interventions that may be used by agencies to address some of these potential social outcomes. So again, what's been fairly unique about this, and it's at the bottom of that first slide, is the level of collaboration which has been undertaken, and it's something that I'm very proud of. I know Amy is as well, and we need to acknowledge the great work that's been done by the teams under us to do this, and that continues to this day. So it's involved police, DPC, health, customer service, education, communities and justice. It's been quite a collaboration, and again something that we're very proud of. Next slide. So as I said, the first part of this this body of work was a lit review, and done in 2 parts. The first by Faxia, looking at the impact of this economic downturn historically, and it's important to note, and something that I've thought a lot about. This is a backwards look at what has happened internationally around the world in Western societies in terms of social outcomes that we've seen coming from economic downturn and when economic conditions worsen historically. So again, it's our best guess, I guess, is the best way backwards about predicting the future. So the Faxia review looked at a range of different things, and in summary, at a very high level, it found that an economic downturn induced by COVID was likely to negatively impact on mental health outcomes and on the rate of suicide. That is probably the crux of it. I know that sort of sounds like perhaps that's common sense, but having some economic rigor behind it was key to identifying what we could do to try and address that. But most of the studies were coming out of the United States and Europe, but some local ones as well. But one of the next key findings was that the economic downturn may lead to an increase in child safety concerns. A lot of data coming out of the US in relation to that. Effective housing interventions may, and I say may, reduce the risk of homelessness. So that was certainly the case in Australia post the GFC. And the fourth major finding was that economic downturn will also impact negatively on those that are already economically disadvantaged. So which makes sense. The next slide. In terms of Boxar's work, most looked at the impact of crime and alcohol and other drug use. There's a couple of points that I'll sort of get to at the end in relation to the forecasting side of things when it comes to crime, because we're not looking. Crime is not the same as what it was, I guess, back in say 1991, during that economic downturn. But I'll touch on that later. But the Boxar review found that economic downturn will likely increase property crime rates, especially amongst young men with a low level of education. It also found, for example, I'll stop there. For example, one US study found that even a 1% point increase in unemployment may well equate to property crime arrests increasing by 2.22%. Again, different comparison, different crime environment in the United States to here, and again, looking backwards at what has historically taken place is not the same, I guess, as looking that would occur now or into the future. The other findings were that an economic downturn can have a long-lasting effect, which makes sense as well. And in terms of young people, that long-lasting effect can last for up to a decade. The review found that alcohol and illicit drug consumption increases for young people during periods of economic downturn, but not across the whole population, which is interesting. And of note, there was limited evidence of a causal relationship between economic downturn and violent crime, and mixed evidence in relation to domestic violence. And from a policing perspective, that seems to have been what's played out practically on the ground from our observations as a police force in New South Wales. Next slide. So I guess that data was used by the economics branch of DPC to use it for some quasi forecasting around two particular areas. First one being suicide rates, and the second one being property crime. Now, the quasi forecasting indicates that based on unemployment forecasts suggest that suicides were expected to rise between 60 and 180 under a higher unemployment rate than what we normally see annually. And as you can see on the slide, that's from a base rate of suicide of around 900 in 2018. From a policy perspective, when you think that, you know, one of the Premier's priorities is towards zero suicides, that poses and still poses a significant risk for us as policy professionals and in dealing with that moving forward. The forecasting also predicts that property crime is likely to increase, including an estimated 35% increase in break-in and steals. Now, I guess that's where I'll jump in and say, again, that property crime is not the same as what it was back in 1991. You know, we aren't seeing, and nor have we for a long time, video recorders being stolen from houses and passed off in pubs that we saw back in that time. So property crime itself is in my mind, a very broad category, and I think it should include things like the changing, you know, the nature of crime at the moment, more cyber-based theft and those sort of things. So I just caution around that and the I guess the strict interpretation of what property crime means. We most certainly have not seen for some time break-in and steal rates going up at all. Far the opposite, to be perfectly honest. So I just mentioned that. And you know, I think when it comes to property crime, you are more likely to see those theft-type crimes being carried out using other mediums like technology, etc. Next. So what we did was look at or try to get an understanding of the expected impact of an economic downturn at a regional level. Now, I always get this wrong, but I'll try and get it right. The composite susceptibility index on the slide that you can see presents early work that was done by New South Wales Health and the Department of Community Justice to try and predict the COVID-related economic downturn by region. The table combines measures of economic vulnerability, including the ABS's COVID Economic Vulnerability Index, with measures of disadvantage, such as the Index of Relative Socioeconomic Disadvantage. So it's been combined with historical figures for the indicators that you can see, and to produce a combined index, which is the black column on the right-hand side that you can see. So what does it tell us? In a snapshot, and as of, I guess, August last year, we predicted that the most economically vulnerable regions in New South Wales were going to be Sydney, followed by country and coastal regions, which lines up, I guess, most recently with what we've seen with the use of JobSeeker and JobKeeper data, which we'll touch on shortly. We also anticipated the highest susceptibility rate for mental health outcomes also appeared to be in New South Wales coastal regions. If you look across other social issues like domestic violence and homelessness, we expected that regions with the most economic and social vulnerabilities would be in the northern rivers and north coast areas, western New South Wales, south and southwest Sydney. Again, a lot of those areas were already economically disadvantaged, particularly out west as well. Next. So at the moment, the project itself is in a we're getting towards a business as usual phase where we're monitoring the data as it comes in. The Department of Customer Service are preparing a report for us on a monthly basis of key leading data indicators. And what you're seeing there is a comparison, a 3-month comparison between October and December 2019 and October and December 2020, which is interesting. So what we've seen is an overall decrease across crime indicators, which again is not surprising from a policing perspective, given the restrictions and those sorts of things. And I think the longer term crime situation is something that that may well change over time. But again, a snapshot, those 3-month periods, we're not seeing an increase at all like was predicted. We have seen a small decrease in reported domestic violence related assault and call outs for domestic violence, which is interesting in itself. But we have seen some indicators that are rising, and particularly around the area of child safety. We've seen a 16% increase in the number of children and young people reported over those periods at risk of significant harm, and a 10.4% increase in the number of children and young people involved in child concern reports. There's been a small decrease in the number of applications for housing assistance, almost less than 4% decrease. Priority applicants to the New South Wales Housing Register have increased, however, by 18.2%. What is of significance in my mind is that we're seeing increases in mental health indicators, including almost 21% increase in calls to mental health helpline, and almost 3% increase in the number of emergency department presentations for self-harm, which again does, I guess, ring some alarm bells. The number of drug and separately alcohol presentations are down by around 6% and 1.1% respectively. So this, as I said, is data that we're tracking on a monthly basis to see whether or not the forecasting is coming to fruition. So being used by agencies and shared to ensure that they can address emerging concerns as they come up. Next slide. So, as I said, we've also been looking at the same indicators at a regional level and comparing the percentage change between the same period, October to December 2019 and October to December 2020. And what we're seeing is that housing indicators are consistently elevated in regional areas, including the Far West and Arana areas, New England and Northwest, as well as the Mid-North Coast. It's consistent with our predictions. Domestic violence-related assaults are elevated in the North Coast region. However, the highest number of events remains regional and remote areas like the Far West, Arana, New England and Northwest, again with areas that are already economically disadvantaged, some of those places. The inner cities experienced the highest increase in unemployment, with the highest unemployment rates experienced in inner Sydney, Coffs Harbour, Grafton and Parramatta in the inner southwest. Mental health services processed were in high volume and are increasing in Sydney across the board, followed by Richmond, the Richmond and Tweed areas in Illawarra. And emergency presentations for self-harm are increased in the Mid-North Coast in regional areas and also particularly for young people. As I said, crime indicators were relatively stable across the regions, if not reducing, and all regions have seen reductions in property crime, which again makes sense in my mind as a police officer, given the changing nature of property crime in itself and the restrictions in movement that we saw throughout those times when compared. For child protection measures, the highest volume and increases were in regional areas, including the Far West and Arana, and New England and Northwest and the Mid-North Coast. In Sydney suburbs, Newcastle and Lake Macquarie were also reporting above average increases in events for those 3-month comparison periods. Next slide. And finally, before I hand over to the wonderful Amy, we also looked at some analysis to highlight regions that have been impacted across multiple indicators. And from what you can see on the slide that's in front of you, Newcastle and Lake Macquarie have been impacted by COVID across the board, including increases of 22% for reports of concern reports, I should say, for children and young people, a 29% increase in children reporting as risk of serious harm, and a 60% increase in priority applications on the New South Wales Housing Register. One must wonder, I guess, with the current flooding crisis about the impact that will have in terms of compounding those figures as well. That's followed by Far West and Orana, which has high levels of underlying disadvantage as well, and regional areas including the Illawarra, New England and Northwest and Central West are also experiencing increases across multiple indicators. Again, the North is also vulnerable, as I said, and we will yet to see the compounding impact, I guess, of the flood situation as well. I'll now hand over to Amy.
Thanks so much, Mick Welling. And also thank you to Leah, who's driving the slides. I feel like, you know, Mick and I get to be the mouthpieces, but there's so much that sits behind it in terms of people's great work. And Leah was essentially, you know, the project director on this project and has brought all of this together, using lots of information and data from around government and, you know, working alongside New South Wales Police as well. So just to call out Leah personally. So Mick's kind of painted a picture of what we did to get the project to the place that it was. And now I think this next piece is about why this project is kind of ongoing and continuing, because the picture continues to emerge. And so we came up with our initial findings based on what we knew as the existing situation in terms of relevant social impacts and social indicators, how they then were exacerbated or changed as a result of COVID. And now, as we're kind of coming out of COVID, there's still changes in the picture. And one of the first things I was going to cover in that regard is what's happening with JobKeeper and JobSeeker. So, you know, sometimes something good happens, the economy strengthens slightly, which it has in recent times, but then at the same time, the Australian government's JobKeeper program is actually scheduled to cease this week. And then JobKeeper will also be returning to pre-pandemic levels, so with kind of a lower level of payment. And so it's really important to understand that while it might mean that, you know, parts of the economy are okay, actually who is impacted by this, the JobKeeper and JobSeeker emerging picture. And often it impacts particular regions and it impacts people who are already experiencing vulnerabilities. And that's really the picture that we're trying to understand so that we know how to respond. So as you're probably aware, at the peak of the pandemic, around 1 in 5 Australians Australians who were employed received JobKeeper. And this has since then reduced by half in early 2021. But New South Wales actually had 34% of all of the Australia-wide JobKeeper applications. And for New South Wales specifically, the regions with the highest JobKeeper applications were Sydney, and then Central Coast and Richmond Tweed. And it's interesting, I would suspect that a lot of that was due to job losses in certain sectors such as hospitality, retail, tourism and travel, where those sectors have been really impacted by the restrictions and then the pandemic itself. The increased job seeker payment was a great thing and particularly protective for people who were vulnerable. And the total number of the number of people who received some sort of unemployment income support payments through that program doubled across Australia during December 2019 to May 2020. So kind of the peak of where we were at from an economic downturn perspective. But the total number of job seeker and youth allowance recipients in New South Wales is 498,000. So, you know, quite a high proportion of job seeker payments actually reside in New South Wales, 32%. And so I suppose what we're seeking to do is looking at the kind of overall regional impact of COVID-19 and overlaying the impact of now the fact that JobKeeper will be disappearing and JobSeeker will be reduced, what does that look like? And really, you know, Sydney, particular southwest, city and inner south and the central coast are likely to be negatively impacted. So even though the economy is getting stronger, losing approximately $21 million of those payments per fortnight will definitely have an impact from a socioeconomic perspective and a social outcomes perspective. Leah, if I could just have the next slide. So that's the kind of JobSeeker. This point really is to just remind everyone that COVID-19 is not the only impact and crisis impacting New South Wales communities. So with many regions are still dealing with the ongoing impacts of drought, floods and the Black Summer bushfires. We know that many LGAs that have been affected by these disasters already had what's called low adaptive capacity, or that's kind of code for existing socioeconomic disadvantage. And so really what we're seeing is a lot of this is disadvantage layered on disadvantage. So in terms of the codes on the map there, analysis of COVID-19 impacts suggests that the drought-affected LGAs near the Queensland border, these are the ones seen in green, are also the most at risk of COVID-19 economic impacts. And then we can see coloured in red what we're calling the triple disadvantaged LGAs, those impacted by drought, bushfires and now COVID. So that's, you know, North Coast and Southeast border with Victoria. And then other LGAs that are at risk really are a lot of coastal LGAs impacted by bushfires, as seen in yellow. So I suppose government responses really need to take into account the compounding effects when planning for long-term recovery. It's not isolated incidents, it's thinking about drought, bushfires and COVID and what effect that has on people. Slide 12. This is when I talk about the sad bit of the presentation, when we really get into the kind of, you know, where do the you know, the negatively impacts lie, but then we do get on to what we're going to do about it. So take heart. But the next couple of slides really focus in on different cohorts of people who really have been kind of disenfranchised by this. The first being young people. And so by the cohort we're talking about specifically here is people aged 15 to 24. Again, this is due to their overrepresentation in industries impacted back at the public health orders, such as hospitality and retail. And the unemployment rate for young people continues to increase. So it's at January 2021, it's at 14.7%, which is really high. Even and a year ago, it was at 11.9%. So youth unemployment's obviously or always, well, for a while been higher than broader population unemployment, but this is particularly high. And young women aged 15 to 24 experienced the sharpest job loss rate of any particular cohort. There's also, and it's concerning because there were marginal gains made after a seasonal job boost in the summer of 2021, but it's slipped back again. So young women aged 15 to 24 are particularly impacted. And there's also been a notable drop in young people engaged in further education, which is also concerning. So the proportion of young people aged 20 to 24 who are not engaged in any employment or study increased to 16%. Which is up from 11% in 2019. So definitely concerned about young people. The next slide, we combine concerns for young people, but also poor mental health outcomes. So children and young people are particularly vulnerable to poor mental health outcomes. We know that. But when you compare it to previous years, mental health related emergency department presentations increased by 26% amongst 0 to 17-year-olds. ED presentations for intentional self-harm and suicide ideation increased by 36% amongst 0 to 17 years, which is far greater increase than the rest of the population. And young people aged 18 to 35, and also, by the way, women and people with a disability have self-reported worse or much worse mental health outcomes in January 2021 than before COVID. So whenever we do that kind of surveying of the population or any sort of self-reporting, that is the cohort of people who really are kind of speaking up through those mechanisms to say that they are feeling worse. But we do know that the suicide rate is significantly higher amongst men than women. So just something to add to there. The next slide is actually about the gendered impacts of COVID. So during COVID, women faced faster rates of job loss in the initial stage of the pandemic. And again, I think that really relates to what industries were impacted by social distancing requirements, but also casualised employment. Women are a lot more likely to be in casual or part-time roles. Men experience greater job loss overall, but the existing inequality between men and women in a workforce sense has only been continued or exacerbated in that women continue to be disproportionately underemployed or not in the labour force. 60% of the not in the labour force cohort are women. And again, we're slowly recovering economically from COVID, but that little uptick that I talked about before since the start of the year in women's unemployment, it's not a clear and consistent picture toward economic recovery without some form of intervention by government and other sectors who are able to make those interventions. So speaking of interventions, the next slide is the good news. So this is what government has done so far to address the social impacts of COVID. And then we'll talk about how we're likely to continue and what's going to emerge. But New South Wales stimulus spending really did focus on that economic stimulus with a focus on jobs, because obviously for a sustained economic growth and recovery, jobs is really the way to go. So that includes stuff like payroll tax cuts, $107.1 billion infrastructure pipeline, and then sector-specific support packages for creative sector, tertiary education sector. We've done stuff for unis and the film industry, helping out local councils, arts rescue and restart package. So those are kind of good economic stimulus stuff. But we'll also, when we get to the budget, show that there's actually been significantly increased social policy spending than in recent years. And I gave a presentation on budget day, and I actually said, I think this is a budget where government shows it cares about people, because it really did make some extra effort in areas such as, mental health and youth and that type of thing, which we'll get to in a moment. The next slide talks about basically what did we do? How did we identify what the priority interventions should be? So in the lead up to the last budget, we all worked with relevant agencies to identify interventions that could go specifically to these policy areas. So basically we went in and said, okay, these are the issues of concern where consequences already seem to be sprouting up, including geographically, and where cohorts are feeling the impacts most acutely. And then we're like, right, what's evidence-based? What are the interventions that we already know because they've been evaluated, or we know that they already apply best practice? And is there an intervention in that category, like a proven that works one, that we can apply to those cohorts? And then, of course, there's the scale of impact versus the cost of providing the service. That's, your classic cost-benefit analysis. And then also looking at timeframes for implementation. So does some stuff need to be done quickly, to get the support and rescue out there, whereas some can allow for a longer project ramp up because it's more of a long-term issue that we want to start to turn the dial on. Next one is about the budget. This is a very busy slide. My favourites in the budget, if you're to pick favourites, free preschool. To support children and families, 144,000 kids who are now, set on a better trajectory than they otherwise would have been. Social housing supply, which is good. That's great from an economic stimulus and jobs perspective, but obviously also for its predominant purpose of providing stability for the families who live in it. funding fee-free places for training under the Skilling for Recovery program, building extra capabilities to get people into the care workforce, so aged care and disability, huge job opportunities there. And then, thank goodness, based on the other stuff I said, significant funding for mental health, so including those mental health packages. There was also some stuff that focused on specific cohorts, such as return to work program for women, COVID-19 Aboriginal Community Organisation grants program. Police have done some great stuff on youth, you know, PCYC and Rise Up and all of that, that actually looks at diversion from the criminal system into jobs. So all of those things did receive a level of funding in the budget to allow them to continue, which is great. I think my final slide is on next steps. So what we're going to do now is we need to continue to, basically we're like this, you know, like gem of information that we can deploy to help governments make good decisions. So we're actually going to do three things. We're going to keep monitoring those indicators that, you know, Mick talked to us, particularly in the first part of this presentation, so that we're keeping an eye on what's happening with, you know, mental health and child protection and domestic violence and crime, etc. We're going to continue to update our list of possible government interventions as we know more. And a lot of it, I find as a public servant, is about having stuff ready for when the question's asked. So making sure that we know what we're going to ask for when, you know, we are allowed to pitch in with an offer. And then providing advice based on those two work streams to our government decision makers so that they can, you know, have the right information to make the decisions as to what they do, particularly with the upcoming budget. So really hope these interventions, you know, help mitigate the social outcomes of COVID, and also that we can, through this project, can provide information to the right people so that the right interventions get made at the right time in the right place. So that is it from me. And I think, Mick, do you want to add anything before we take questions?
No, I mean, I also too just want to acknowledge Leah. I know she's on, and really at the end of the day, this is largely her work and her intellectual property that's gone into this, and has done a tremendous job. It makes it easier for us. But no, I'm happy to take questions, and again, just re-emphasise, I guess, the collaboration across a range of departments in this body of work, and it's something that I think is very important, and we need to keep track of it for obvious reasons.
Thank you, Mick and Amy, and we do have a broad section of attendees from those agencies today, so I'm really pleased that they're getting to see their work showcased. Now, if you haven't found, our audience, if you haven't found this already, we are writing questions into the chat, which is the little bubble with the writing. If you haven't found that already, you can pop your question in there, and then I'll coordinate the questions to Amy and Mick so that we know which order it's coming in. And I might start off just while people are gathering their thoughts. And I hope it's not too much of a technical question, but what is quasi forecasting?
Good question.
I can have a bit of a go, but you go ahead, Mick.
You, Aim. At the end of the day, you know, forecasting obviously is a fair bit of work and analysis that goes into it. But it was, given the time frames that we had and the competitive frame, the need to address it. You know, it's and Leah will undoubtedly correct me on this, but it's our best guess in terms of taking into basic factors and looking at what might.
Exactly. Yeah, maybe Leah needs to switch her camera on. You can join the panel.
No, I would agree with that.
Yeah, do you agree with it? The comment I was going to make on that was I've got a team of data analytics specialists, and we asked them to do this task, and they were like, you know, walking around with their head in their hands because the whole quasi forecasting, you know, it's not 100% accurate. But the point of it is we look backwards and say, okay, in past recessions, for every 1% increase in unemployment, there's a 4% increase in suicide. We will use what we know based on the past to have a go at predict, and we just needed it to know enough to know which paths to go down, right? It didn't have to be, you know, to the decimal point accurate. But yes, when I asked them to quasi forecast, they were quite appalled.
Can I just add something to that? Like Amy just hit on a really good point there, and it might sort of, I guess, answer a number of questions. Is really our best guess. obviously looking backwards provides us with a base to, to compare or what might come. But given the changing conditions, this is unique. We all know, this is a unique situation. This is our best guess at what might come, and therefore that leads to the policy intervention.
Yeah, a bit like, if I can visualise it for everyone, perhaps the floods where we were waiting for flood modelling, and then the floods came and we could see exactly what was happening. So it's much harder, I think, to pick up on that social disadvantage.
Yeah.
So we now have a question from Josh. Can you come online and we can have your question, please?
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear
Sure
you.
can.
Great. So 2 questions. Mick, one for you is, I just wondered whether you guys had done any work around potential underreporting, because particularly in the domestic violence space, in lockdown, yes, we may have seen some falls, but is that the true nature of it, and how you guys compensate for that? And the other question, Amy, I thought you might be able to have a go at is, we've got all these targeted interventions. How are we trying to make sure, or how are we checking to see whether or not those interventions are actually having the impact that we intended? And I'm Josh from the Small Business Commission, by the way.
Great questions, Josh.
I'll give you time to think, Aim, for yours, because that's very hard. Simple answer, Josh, is yes. Throughout the COVID period, we were looking at underreporting. We always do when it comes to crimes of violence, particularly domestic violence and those crimes that occur in the home. We also looked at delayed reporting. Whether or not during the peak lockdown period, we would see a spike in reporting afterwards, where people, when they did have more mobility, were able to make reports. And look, we were surprised. We thought, first of all, that we'd see a drastic increase in domestic violence type incidents because of the fact that people were, literally locked up at home in some ways. But we did, from a practical point of view, policing did see a lot of calls for increased tension within the homes and tension around things, but that did not correlate into a big spike in domestic violence type incidents at this point.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when I talk to and I'm sure there are some DCJ people on the phone, when I talk to my, wonderful colleagues who specialise in this area, when they look at other ways that you can get a sense as to, how the prevalence of things like domestic violence during COVID, such as calls to helplines, yes, Mick, they would agree with you that the reality might have been slightly different from what was transpiring in the reported sense. But that wasn't my question. I think I'm going to maybe see if Leah wants to comment as well. In addition to my data geniuses, I also have a team who specialise in evaluation of policy and programs. And I think this just goes back to the kind of, policy 101, where, you can't assess whether something's effective unless you're evaluating it as you go, and you can't judge what you can't measure type situation. And so I think no matter what these policies are and what sphere they lie in, a lot of the complexity with this is these issues aren't just an education issue, aren't just a justice issue, aren't just a health issue. They're a whole of government issue. But if when we set them up, we put the right kind of mechanisms around it to evaluate and measure it, then we should be able to make some good decisions. And sometimes I've been finding, again, from my justice colleagues, stuff that sounds like a good idea, to people who are sitting arm's length and sitting in the theory of it, when they get on the ground in the regional area and see the impacts and start to measure them, it's not quite on point. And that's where we iterate, try again. So that's the comment I'd make on that one. Leah, do you have anything to add as the expert?
No, just only to note that I think we've made some strides, especially within New South Wales Treasury, with the evidence bank and the work that Treasury are doing on outcomes budgeting. So we've obviously got some way to go, but we're taking steps in the right direction.
Megana, can you join now for your question?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for that great content. My question is in relation to the potential increases in child-related, child-concerned indicators. I was just wondering if you were able to identify any factors driving those increases, particularly when you think about the potential underreporting in DV violence related. So was there any relationships, key trends that you were able to identify at this point in time?
Good question. Look, I don't have anything to add to that from my perspective. Again, Leah, you may be able to add this, but you know, I can only reflect back on the increased tension within the home and how that correlates out to I guess you know, putting children more at risk because of that tension within the home, and that's an anecdotal guess, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
I would just add we've done some consultation with regional New South Wales and particularly the regional leadership executives, and this is only anecdotal, but we've heard that the pressures on affordable housing may be having a flow-on effect for the child protection space. Obviously, we've had those periods of movement restriction that also play into this, but we have to consider across the board for all these indicators that there are pre-existing trends, and child safety is one of those.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And just a comment on, you know, because well, in my current role and my new role, the economy is my biggest kind of focus, including economic recovery. But so much of this is just related to recession and unemployment. And interestingly, this recession it's quite different from others in terms of the people who are losing their jobs are people who are often already socioeconomically disadvantaged, as we were saying earlier, and also are more likely to result in sustained unemployment. So it's the kind of once these people are disengaged from the workforce and study, it's very hard to get back in. If they're young, that can have lifelong impacts, etc. It's not your investment bankers who are out of work for 6 months, and that, you know, so it's the sustained rather than the unemployment being rate high, but there's high churn within that. It's really the same people who are out of work for a long duration. And I think it goes without saying that the impacts on families and kids and those sort of situations is really quite stark.
Brilliant, thank you.
We now have Zoe, which I think a question that will continue this theme.
Yeah, Zoe.
Hi, how are you, Amy? It's nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you. I know that voice.
Not surprisingly.
I saw you on the corner I saw you chatting to the Governor General on the corner of Macquarie Street. I know. Sorry, this is being recorded, but I just thought I'd share that with the group.
And it's nice to see you, sir, because we've been doing a lot with Youth Command in the last year and a half, and so applause to them and all the work that they've been doing. Perhaps it might be useful as well in terms of the last question. We're happy to share the polling that we did all of last year that went up through DPC. So if that helps in terms of children's thinking around it, we'll share that. My question around young people is, how do you think and what do you think are your kind of mechanisms for ensuring they understand that this investment is being made for the benefit of them, and how we communicate that properly, because they might not all be engaged in Service New South Wales or other platforms.
Zoe, you know, I'm just going to ask that question right back at you.
Well, yeah, I'm with Amy actually, Zoe. You know, one thing that we haven't done outside of government with this body of work is actually publicise it. And, you know, there's probably a range of reasons for that to this point, but it's something that we probably should look at in terms of, you know, messaging around this body of work and the fact that it is occurring out there and it is aimed at, you know, trying to get ahead of the curve and help people, particularly young people, moving into the future. So I might take that on notice, actually, if that's all right.
Wow, policy in action through this webinar series. I didn't think to add that to our spruiking of the series that you could actually influence policy by joining in, but obviously it's happening live as we speak. We now have a question. I think it continues the kind of communication theme, but I guess instead of focusing on our intended recipients of the beneficiaries of changes in social policy, we're pivoting, Lisa, your question about communication between agencies, which I think is interesting, particularly as this was a cross-agency piece of work.
Yes, sorry. So my question was around, as many of the work involves multiple agencies being involved, what sort of measures are you doing to ensure that all the agencies that are relevant to ensuring that that measure is met is communicating to each other regularly and often to make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel, you're not duplicating efforts that already exist and then throwing more money at it? Thank you.
Yes. Great question. Again, I think Leah will probably have a comment, and Mick as well. I mean, from my perspective, I feel like the buy-in at the secretary level for this project, Mick and I presented to Secretary's Board, and they've asked for kind of mini updates since, in a way, and then my ability to kind of, you know, for me, draw down on goodwill with some of the deputy secretaries from those agencies, particularly DCJ, and ones where we really needed them to kind of open up, so to speak, and share the data and be open to perhaps even pivoting some of what they were planning to do, changing it a little bit based on what we know now. And so I found, you know, people like Simone Walker at DCJ, and then, you know, Nigel Lyons in health, and you know, George Harris in education, those type of characters who we deal with on a day-to-day basis. It was having their buy-in at that level that then meant they could talk to their teams and say, no, that, you know, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And if we work together rather than all trying to do our own thing, we'll have a better impact for New South Wales. Mick, was that your experience as well?
I agree, Eamon. I think the Secretary's Board is a key player, obviously, in driving that downward. We also presented to the Social Policy Senior Officers Group, you know, as this was sort of growing, and took on board feedback from different depth level representatives filtered into the project. But the foundations of it came out of, to be honest, Project Spring, which was the original group set up, you know, with representation on it. And at those, I guess, slightly lower level than secretary, those people were talking already around indicators and pulling data together with the Department of Customer Service. So the sharing of it is really being driven from secretaries down, and you know, we would all hope in a perfect policy environment that's causing it to happen in an efficient way.
Yeah. Leah, what was your experience at kind of officer level?
Yeah, it's been a great experience working especially with the data custodian areas across New South Wales government to be able to bring this data together, which is actually quite revolutionary. And we're also working quite closely with our Treasury colleagues in the previous budget, and I'm also working up to this next budget to make sure that our findings are communicated into that process.
Yeah, good one.
It's lovely to hear of that collaborative experience that you've had. I think, you know, it does make it kind of easier for everyone to engage when there's a really clear objective that that government has. So perhaps we can all learn from that experience. Now, I'm not sure whether this is a question or a comment, but I'd really like to hear from you, Margaret O'Dwyer, because I know you're regionally based, and it's good to have that perspective, particularly in this topic.
Okay, I'm based in the Murray. So we had border closures both from New South Wales and from Victoria. There was about 20 weeks where borders were closed from both states.
Yep.
Now, the Murray Regional Tourism Board undertook a survey of tourism businesses that has some, I mean, it's more economic data, but I'm just wondering if that's the type of stuff that you'd like to see.
Okay. Absolutely.
All right, and perhaps you should reach out to the Cross-Border Commissioner as well, James McTavish.
Yes. Cross-Border Commissioner is definitely engaged.
Okay.
I mean, because we do obviously, there's Project Spring, which is all that economic recovery, but there's COVID response more generally, and some of that's done out of my team. And I'm very conscious of the border communities and the impact that this has all had on them.
Okay. Should I send that through to Louisa? Is that the best place?
Yeah, good idea. Yep, she'll connect us all.
Great.
Yes, thank you for making the point, because I think there is something very nuanced and specific about from a geographical and social impacts perspective.
And I think we have, we've still got time for at least one or two more questions. Nanda Kumar, you have a question about hospitality and tourism sectors.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. Look, the international research very clearly predicts that this sector has been affected very badly by this pandemic. But now that your JobKeeper is now coming to an end, are there any interventions planned by the New South Wales government? I'm sure your data somewhere should tell you how many have been affected by this in this particular sector, hospitality and tourism. And that's where probably, and Sydney is a major draw, as we all know. And then, of course, the government is saying we'll promote domestic tourism and all those. What special, from the state government point of view, what interventions are planned? That will have a major impact on your post-pandemic economic recovery, is my observation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to make a comment from what I know, and we only know as much as we know as per our existing mandates. But for me, I know there is a lot of talk and plans, and I think even some announcements already around that kind of short-term economic almost boost for hospitality and tourism. And some of it's kind of spending vouchers and things like that, but some of it's more directly kind of funded to the relevant organisations who've been impacted, and that goes for global travel and exports and all of that, as well as domestic. But I think for some of it, we need to think broader, which might be exactly what you're getting at, around who do we need to retrain and how do we retrain them into the jobs of the future? Because even if the hospitality sector returns and tourism returns, things are always they're probably going to look a little different for a longer period of time. So we need to kind of think a bit more sustainably in terms of retraining people and reskilling them into jobs of the future. And government's just announced Careers New South Wales, which where people can go. It's currently an online experience, but I think there's a desire to bring it physically. Go and kind of get that almost the careers advice and the concierging into, right, I'm good at this and I have these skills. What else would I be suited to, and how do I get trained into that? So I think for those sort of sectors, we need to think longer term. And that includes, yes, the experience we're in now, but also things like technology disruption. So we need to be smart regardless of a pandemic impact.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that by just saying, if you look at the last sort of slide there about the interventions that are being funded, that Skilling for Recovery has got a fair portion of money that's been allocated to it for that purpose. And these were, of course, the hospitality industry, given the age, I guess, of those that are largely employed and are going to be impacted upon, more than others. But we were talking about this coming out of bushfire recovery where hospitality and those sort of jobs that local youth, I guess, or younger people in society were largely employed in, and how we could reskill people into other areas. And I guess take advantage of a bad situation about leapfrogging into the future around redesigning jobs for the future based on technology and jobs that don't exist yet, but they will in 30 years, those sort of things.
I think we have time for one very quick question before we finish up. Edmund, are you still on the line? I know your question was from earlier. If not, I'll ask for you. So we've been really talking about the almost here and now, but into the short-term forecast. Edmund was worried about, or wondering about the long term. So 10 years, what's down the track? What's your crystal ball telling you on the basis of forecasting and your experience?
I guess I can't answer that other than say that's why we use quasi forecasting. That's going to take like proper longer term proper analysis in terms of forecasting, and who knows what's around the corner. And nobody expected COVID. Nobody expected, we can expect natural disasters and those sorts of things, but nobody expected us to be where we are now. Look, it's a very difficult question to answer, but this type of work should continue, and the collaboration across agencies based on this type of work is probably the key to being ahead of the curve in the longer term as well as the short term.
Yeah, I agree with that. The other thing I'd say about the longer term, there are so many variables. For example, Australia is very dependent on the global economy. So a lot of this depends on that kind of geopolitical and what's going to happen globally and what that's going to do to Australia. But for me, if we want to create a really positive longer term future, then we need to spin this on its head, and government make sure that we're taking steps to create a positive impact out of COVID. And so, you know, a lot of that is around, right, well, what are the opportunities now that people are interacting with digital in a lot more, you know, like informed way? Environmental sustainability, focus on health and well-being, attracting investment into New South Wales, because we are like globally famous right now because we handled the pandemic so amazingly. So how do we kind of create a better life for people and more jobs through using the opportunities out of this, and therefore mitigating the adverse social impacts, because society as a whole will be more healthy.
Yeah, if there's a learning to be had, we're definitely getting more experienced at handling crises. So just to finish up, on behalf of the community of policy professionals, I wanted to thank you, Amy and Mick, for taking the time to speak with us today, and to our audience for the interest and enthusiasm in policy. You've provided some fascinating insights on both the content and also the experience of working across government. And it's a nice kind of follow-on actually from, we heard last year from the Office of the Chief Health Officer on the health response to the pandemic, and I'll put the link to that for people who didn't catch that last year. And also Joanne Wilkie's presentation on responding to crises as a policy practitioner. So I'd also like to thank Nash Condren and Leah Trickett for their support of this webinar, and we'll be back on the 22nd of April after the Easter break, and we're going to be welcoming our first international speaker. The presentation is a little later in the day because between here and Europe the time zones just don't line up, but it's going to be a great presentation. Paul Tahart is a really well-known alumni of ANZOG. He's worked at ANU, and he's based in the Netherlands. So he'll be joining us to talk about policy success, which I know everyone wants to make their policy successful. So I encourage you to join us for that on the 22nd of April. Until then, take care.